Hey, Wildland Fire Crew. Mr. Osborne here. We're going to look at initial attack strategy and tactics today. I'll put the objectives on the instructions page. But what we want to do, we've talked about some of these things before, but in an organized manner, we want to talk about how you address a fire and make the decisions how you're going to fight it. In our 6A's, we want to have awareness. We want to watch for situations of alignment where the fire is in alignment or out of alignment and our relation to that. But then the next four all kind of go together. And we talked about assessment, action plan, arsenal, usually before that. The whole thing of assessment, arsenal, action plan, they're all interrelated. It's almost like the action plan makes you ask for more arsenal or release arsenal. The assessment is what leads to your looking at, well, what do I have? What is the fire doing? All of these things, they're interrelated. The last of our A's is assignment. As each unit gets an assignment and works together with the other units, as we meet our objectives, we get that end plan or end goal accomplished. That's when the fire goes out. So we're going to talk about that today. I wanted to start a little bit with just another little inspiring talk. One of my heroes is Theodore Roosevelt. I read quite a few books about him and some books that he wrote. You might not know very much about Theodore Roosevelt. In my opinion, he was one of our greater presidents. Remember, his face is right up there with Washington and Lincoln. Is it Jefferson is the third one? But then Teddy Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore. He was a powerful force to be reckoned with. As you can see in this picture, man, when he gave a speech, he gave his all. And that's back in the days before microphones, and he would make sure that the person in the back could hear him. He, however, was born very sickly. He had asthma or some other respiratory type of problem. And his father was a very wise man. He pushed him to go outdoors. He said the answer to being sick isn't to lay around, it's to get active. And so Teddy, through his youth, fought off and on with sickness, and yet his dad kept pushing him outside. It was very difficult for Teddy. He lost his father and his first wife. Very close in time to one another, and he had some very harsh situations early on in his life, but he pressed on, and he fought everything with strength. He's kind of famous for he devised the big stick philosophy, that America was a big stick and we should be the strongest in the world. And some people disagree with that philosophy, but Teddy, he was a power to be reckoned with. Well, how powerful was he, and how strong was he in the face of adversity? When he was president, one time a man shot him as he was preparing to give a speech. And if you look at the picture on the right, the one of the X-ray, that's one of the early forms of X-ray. You can see on the bottom left a bullet hole. The guy shot him in the chest. It went through the bottom of his lungs, and yet he still got up and gave a speech. And so if you look at him, he's kind of holding his arm tight to his body, and he's reading his speech. He'd been shot, but he refused to go to the doctor till he gave his speech. Now that's one tough cookie, okay? Maybe you don't believe me. Well, here's the shirt that excuse me, that they took off of him with the bullet hole and his chest all bloodied. So he was a tough guy. And what I want you to get from him is this one quote. It's 2 slides long. This is a longer quote than I usually give you guys, but this is one of Teddy Roosevelt's best quotes. He talked about it's people who talk a lot but don't do a lot. They had no value to him. So Teddy was the kind of guy that don't talk the talk. You need to walk the walk. So it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. He's talking about the Monday morning quarterbacks, those people who have plenty to say after things have been done or that didn't get involved but criticize others for something that they didn't even try to do. So that's what he's talking about here. So it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena. He's talking about boxing there. He was a boxer. Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. Don't give up when you fail. Just keep going. You just learned something. The last part of his quote, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Quitting or giving up because things didn't work out the way you wanted to, in Teddy Roosevelt's eyes, that's the worst. You press on. You give your best. When you don't succeed, you've learned a lesson. Now you try harder. If you're not doing well on your oral exams, you need to do more practice oral exams. If you don't have adequate resume, you go out and you achieve things so that you improve your resume. And that's what Theodore Roosevelt would do. And, by the way, he eventually became governor of New York, vice president of the United States, and later a 2-term president of the United States. He could have been a 3-term president, but he stayed to the precedent. There was no law that said you had to only serve 2 terms at that time. It was made later on. But Teddy, he served his 2 terms and then moved on. So let's talk about strategy and tactics. Strategies are overall plans and actions to control the fire. So the strategy may be to protect threatened structures or use direct attack when possible. Tactics are the techniques to accomplish the strategy. So the art of deploying a direct attack on the fire or an indirect attack. The strategy is the big plan. The tactic is the way you get it done. Okay? And with our strategies, we got to set objectives and goals like we talked about with our own careers. So, first of all, the key to good strategy and tactics, you've got to assess the whole situation. So you have to select the correct strategy and tactics to control the fire in the safest, most efficient, and cost-effective manner. You have to remember, all these resources, they cost money. So you have to balance the fire with what you have. And if you don't have enough, you order more. If you have too much, you need to send them home so they can work on something else. You're constantly working at strategy and tactics. It's a very fluid thing. That's one of the things about wildland fire that makes it unique. You don't just have one strategy. You don't have just one tactic. There's tons of ways to attack the fire, and you have to pick the one that meets the needs of the fire that you're facing. There are a lot of different factors in wildland firefighting, and you have to consider all of those things that we've been studying in awareness and alignment. Well, what's the topography like? Are we on a steep slope? Is the fire running uphill? What side of the mountain is it on? What aspect? Is it getting direct sun? Will it get direct sun later today? Are there topographical features like canyons and saddles and ridges that play a part in this? What kind of fuel are we in? Is it light, medium, heavy? Are we on a high risk, highly rated fire weather day? Is it, are the winds blowing? What's the humidity like? What's the air temperature like? What's our air stability? Are there any inversions? All of these things have to be part of the plan, the keys to making the plan. They all have to be considered. So planning has to begin before you respond. It actually starts the day before or that morning at shift change. First of all, what's the weather forecast for the day? I don't know of a fire station in the United States anymore that doesn't have a computer, or doesn't. Most on their engines have mobile data terminals, and on those computers you'll get the weather. But you can also do your own weather checking. Apps like Ventusky, the NOAA, weather.com. All of these different things can help you assess what's this day going to be like. Is it a high-risk day? Is it a low-risk day? If we get a fire on a misty morning that, I remember one time driving away from a fire that was early in spring. It had run up a hillside, and but what burned was the dead grass from the year before. The green grass from that year was still there. We knew this fire was not going to burn very voraciously or ferociously. We knew it was not going to be much, and we got out there and we put a line around it. We had it out in an hour, did some mop-up. As we drove away, my captain says, "Look at that, Randy. Look back at the fire," and where the fire was. And I looked at this hill, and you couldn't even tell where it was because the green grass was still there over the area that had burned. And that's not something you see all the time. But when you have a fire on a day like that, it's not going to be much. It's not going to be hard. We're going to be able to be super aggressive. But on a 100-degree day with single-digit humidity and winds 15 to 25 miles per hour out of the southwest, we've got another situation. You want to consider who's on duty today. I think I told some of you before about the chief that was working overtime. He wasn't from the Brush area. He worked in the downtown area, and he got an overtime day, and we ended up getting called to the Calabasas fire. This is the one in the 1990s, I think it was, where a Glendale firefighter got burned and a LA fire task force got overrun. It was quite an intense fire. And this chief didn't know the area. He wasn't really that great at wildland firefighting. He knew what he had to know to pass the test to be a chief. But, he got us lost. We're following him. He said, "Everybody follow me. I got our orders." And we're following him. And we got to a certain point, and he said, he pulls off, and he says, "We all need to turn around. I missed our turn." And meanwhile, the fire is coming right at us, and it's picking up speed. And he drove us right into the head of the fire. We all had to shelter in place. I found a cut in the road and tucked up the engine. And the fire went right over us. It wasn't a really big deal. We were safe, but my broom caught fire. Tons of hose had little burn through spots. Yeah, it was quite intense, and it was inexperience that put us in that place. Is everybody's PPEs ready? Is the engine ready? Have you done a once over? Every morning you should be changing out your water. Do you have adequate ice and Gatorades? And is all of your equipment, do you have all the hose you need? Is the tank topped off? Is the foam tank topped off? These are all things that I would do every morning to make sure we were ready. A good captain will look at his crew. Do I have overtimers? Do I have old farts? What do I have working with me today? Because you got to think about that. Are there other fires presently active in the area? Most of the fires we've talked about that have become problem fires were understaffed because of other bigger fires in the area. That was the case with the South Canyon fire, also called Storm King Mountain fire. That was the case with the 30 Mile fire. That was the case with the Glen Allen fire that we talked about earlier. So oftentimes when there's a big fire that's actively going on, you're going to get either really tired crews coming from the other fire, or you're going to be understaffed. So the overall question is, everybody ready? And have you considered the conditions of that day, even before you get rung out on anything? Once you do get dispatched, you need to listen to the tones. You need to listen to the announcements, the way, even the way the dispatcher is saying things. When they say things like many calls, that means not just one person said they saw a little puff of smoke. That means tons of people are calling. So it's a clue. Hey, this is a fire. We're going to find something when we get there. So we want to, when we get there, what type of fire is it? Where is it? Is it at the location that was given over dispatch? Oftentimes it isn't. So we want to correct that location. If you look in our module for this chapter, I've put a document or a page that has sample first in assessment and the things that you need to say. You need to look at that. When you're first in, one of the first things you want to do is tell them that you do have a fire and where it is. Then you're going to describe the fire, what it's doing. You want to note the access or the route of travel. Oftentimes, if it's hard to find where the fire is, we'll put up flagging to direct other crews in so that they know where to go. You want to also notice what other forces have been dispatched, because especially if you're in your first in district, you want to make a decision who's going to go to the hell spot, because those helicopters need water. So you want to send somebody to the hell spot. Do you want it to be the next in engine? Probably not, because you want them to come help you. Maybe the third or fourth in. But maybe you've looked at which forces are coming, and one of those engines that's third or fourth in is, it's one of those stations where the old guys on the brink of retirement are working. Put them at the heli spot. Give them the easier job. They don't want to be climbing those hills anyways. So are there any special hazards to the area? If usually a lot of these fires start right off the freeway, we're going to have to ask for CHP to come and shut down a lane or two for us. So all of these things. Now in the old days, we had to write down the incident numbers and all of that kind of stuff. Now it comes on the mobile data terminals, so you don't have to write it down like you used to, but you need to note especially who's coming. And you're going to get a comm plan, which is great. All of that is going to come over the dispatch. So when you get up there, well, first of all, when does your size up begin? Before you get there. As soon as you pull out of the rig, size up begins. Is the weather that, you've been, you worked out in the morning, and Everybody did their house chores. Captains turned in all the paperwork and done everything on the computer he's supposed to in the morning. Everybody showered up, got dressed. Maybe we ran to the grocery store, got some groceries, came back, made an early lunch because we knew it was a high fire risk day. And we've been sitting inside in the air conditioning, had our nice lunch, and people are snoozing, taking little afternoon naps in the nice cool air. Then all of a sudden we get wrung out. Now when you're pulling out, is the weather the same as it was at 11 when you went to the grocery store? Maybe the temperature's gone up 20 degrees. Maybe the wind's picked up. Maybe the humidity has dropped down. All of these things. You want to observe that. One thing you want to do is you want to look up at the flagpole. Which way is the wind blowing? Is it the way you were expecting? Because that flag is going to tell you something about the wind. Is it standing straight? Well, if it's standing straight, you got an over 20 mile per hour wind, maybe 25. So all of those things are little things you can do right out of the door. As you're driving, you want to start looking at the environment around you, and what are you looking for? You want to be looking for a head of smoke, right? Because the smoke column can tell you a lot. So when you pull out and you start seeing those smoke columns, you got two pictures here of smoke columns. One where the smoke's, maybe it's going a little bit to the left. We got a breeze down near the ground, those mid-flame winds. But then what is it doing? It's going straight up. So that's a sign that we've got a nice convective column starting, but we do have some winds at the level where the fire is. That picture on the right, well, that's a whole different kind of column. That's already forming a pyrocumulus cloud. This is a big fire that's burning very ferociously. So you look at the smoke column and it can tell you a lot. So in our book, there's this list of what the color and column of smoke can mean. You know, if it's a little tiny, lazily rising gray smoke column, this might be a campfire. It might be the early beginnings of a wildland fire, but probably not. If it's narrow, thin, and dark gray to black, well, that could just be somebody starting up a diesel engine. So all of these different things you want to look at. What kind of a smoke column are you seeing? Funny story, we pulled out of the barn once, and one of our captains, who was kind of a know-it-all, he was kind of the guy that was boastful and always talked about what a great firefighter he was, kind of, you know. And we're pulling out of the barn, and he sees a white head of what looked like smoke to him. And before giving it time to really look at it and assess it, he said, "We got smoke showing. We're going to call this the Placerita incident," and da-da-da-da-da. And we keep driving, and I'm noticing that, you know what, that smoke column, it keeps dissipating. It looks more like steam. Yeah, it turned out it was a cogeneration plant that was putting out a ton of steam. It was a colder morning than usual, and it was just steam coming off of a cogen plant. So he was called Steam IC for about a month after that. It was kind of a joke that we all teased him, which he didn't take well because, like I said, he thought he was perfect. But yeah, he was wrong that day. So read through all of these. And, you know, your book has this page in it. So when you get there, you want to, well, first of all, if you saw smoke showing, there's two things you want to do. Hey, this might be a quiz question later on. There's two things you definitely want to do. If you haven't done it already, you want to assign somebody to that helispot, right? And like I said, you probably thought that through earlier in the day. Who am I going to assign to the helispot if we get a fire? But also, you definitely want to say over the radio to your dispatcher. For us, it was LA. LA, engine 111. We have smoke showing. Maybe it's LA, engine 149. We have heavy smoke showing. what does this do? It tells everybody on their way, hey, this is the real deal. Don't be lazy about putting on your gear. You need to be ready when you show up. We got a fire. When you get there, you want to give that original assessment. And like I said, you need to look at that piece of paper that I put in our module. And in your size up, you want to develop a picture of what is happening. This helps the chief who's going to eventually take over. It helps the dispatch center and all of the engines and hot shots that are on their way. It gives them an idea of what we have. So you want to give them a picture of what is happening. You want to tell them what the fire is doing or will do. LA Engine 149 on scene at the crossover quarter-mile south of Templin Highway on the northbound 5. We have a small grass fire running uphill, less than an acre at this point, but building in intensity, and will run the hill. So, and you might then give some assignments. You might also mention the weather. We have a light breeze out of the southwest pushing this fire, and it is picking up in intensity. You want to say whether it's crawling, running, creeping, all of these kind of things. So remember also, size up isn't a one-time activity, but it's going to continue cyclically go on throughout the day. Analyze what you see, draw conclusions, develop a plan. Then later on, in fact, anytime the fire changes, the weather changes, you change in your location, you need to analyze what you see, draw conclusions, and develop a plan. So you're constantly doing it, constantly evaluating, reevaluating, and reacting. And on an original size up, if there is an initial action plan, you want to mention that in your follow-up dispatch and give some assignments. You might give some original assignments at first and then follow-up assignments as engine companies arrive. Sometimes somebody arrives sooner than you thought they were going to get there, and you gave somebody else their assignment. And that might be because they were out at the grocery store. They were already, closer to the fire. You never know. So you need to consider all of these things as the dynamic changes. So you want to explain that spread. So a low rate of spread, we got a picture here of a fire that's actually going downhill. Notice that the burned area is on the uphill side and the unburned is on the downhill side. So we'd call this fire creeping with a low rate of spread, creeping downhill. It's not even really looking like it's driven by the wind, because if you look at the smoke in the sky, it's burning against the wind and against the slope downhill. So this is a fire that if we can catch it really fast, we can put this out pretty quick. Moderate rate of spread would be a fire that's moving 100 to 400 feet per hour. I never heard anybody use those kind of terms, but you judge it, you assess it as you look at it. What kind of fuel is it burning in, and how fast is it burning? A high rate of spread would be something that's moving at 400 to 1,800 feet per hour. Think about that. That's a football field to, what is that? 6 football fields in an hour. Well, sometimes you'll see that in a couple of minutes when it's running uphill, but a high rate of spread is anything that's rapidly moving, either running uphill with a breeze behind it, or our Santa Ana conditions where it's moving at a much, much more rapid speed. Usually we're going to talk about the Santa Anas, though, as being extreme rate of spread, where it's moving over 1,800 feet per hour. And then you can see in this awesome photograph a typical Santa Ana driven fire where, it's just spreading so fast. Resources can hardly get ahead of it. Some of the questions you might want to ask yourself as you size up is the fire spotting. You want to estimate the size. I was never good at that. I had to kind of figure out my ways. If somebody was asking me elevation, I would picture like a floor. Uh, okay, a floor is 10 feet. So that looks like it's 3 to 4 story building that's 40 feet. But then with acres, you wanna. Some people are good at that. Some people aren't. I wasn't really good at it. I had to go out there and have people show me an acre or show me a quarter acre, and then kind of get that size in my mind, and then compare that to what I'm seeing. It's really, you look silly when you say we got 4 acres burning, and everybody gets there and they're going, dude, this isn't even an acre. What are you talking about? So you want to be accurate, but again, you're estimating. You want to consider the weather, the lay of the land, the fuel types. Are there any exposures? Is a huge question, because it's going to make a difference on how many apparatus are we sending to direct attack on the fire, and how many apparatus are we going to send for a defensive action or an indirect action, where they're going to go to exposures and try and protect those exposures, or do firing out to burn out fuel in front of the fire, or whatever we might need to do. So that's a big question. Are there any exposures? And remember, exposures aren't just houses. It's any kind of a valuable resource. It could be somebody's avocado grove. Well, you know what? That's the source of their income. So we need to consider that as a serious exposure to be protected. And then, of course, like I said, as you assess everything, then you want to consider your arsenal. Do I have the resources that I need? During these drought conditions, LA County has added 2 engines to their first in response. It used to always be 5 engines. And now, once we get into the brush season, it's 7 engines. They've increased the amount of hand crews, the amount of helicopters. There's always a minimum of 2 chiefs now being dispatched, not just 1. So the resources are more that are being sent originally to the fire on the first alarm. But okay, do I need a second alarm? Or do I need just a couple more engines? Well, you don't want to piecemeal it. You don't want to say, okay, 2 more. Oh, now 2 more. Oh, now 2 more. That's a silly way of doing things. If you think you're going to need more, call a second alarm or call for some strike teams. And of course, the first in captain has that opportunity to name the fire. And that's kind of a, first in's privilege. Sometimes guys will name the U.S. Forest Service, they have a system, and they name the fires according to their system. LA County, first in gets to name it. Sometimes fires' names will get changed by the overhead, because, in my district, 149's on the 5, we had the Templin fire sometimes 2 times a year. So because we get so many fires in our little Bermuda Triangle, in between Castaic and Pyramid Lake. So, you change the name. You think about something else. Sometimes guys would name the fire after their girlfriend or their daughter, or something that happened that day. So there's a funny story. In the old days, we used to have 3 dispatch locations for LA County Fire. There was an east location, there was LA, and there was Antelope, for the Antelope Valley and Santa Clarita. So when you would talk to them, you would say Antelope, engine 111, Antelope, engine 73. So this one old captain, it was his last day, and he got a fire. And he had always thought, and he was out in the Antelope Valley, he always thought it would be funny to call a fire the Antelope Fire. And that might not seem funny to you at first, but then what was happening, whenever dispatch talks to the IC, they call them by the name of the fire. So if it's the Templin fire, they'd say Templin IC, LA, and then they'd give their message. Or they'd just say Templin, LA, and they'd give their message. So for the rest of the day, whenever they were talking, whether it was the dispatch or the IC, they'd say Antelope, Antelope. Antelope, this is antelope. Go ahead, antelope. And I mean, the antelope thing just went on and on and on. Antelope, antelope. Okay, antelope, antelope, antelope. And everybody got a big laugh out of it. Yeah, but you know, that's the privilege of getting to name the fire when you're first in. Some of the other questions, do we have a point of origin? We want to make that our anchor point. Are there any natural barriers that can help us? If we look ahead and see a big cut on the ridge line, we want to hold it at that ridge. Do we see a road where we might be able to hold it, or a rock outcropping, or a lake, or anything? We need to note any special safety hazards. Are there power lines down? Do we need CHP to come and close some lanes for us? Are there local engagement rules to be aware of? I mentioned this a couple of times as we've been talking in class, but if you're in the national parks, there's different rules. If you're in a state park, there's different rules. If you are in what we call state responsibility area or SRA land, and not as strict rules. We can pull in the dozers, we can do whatever we need, but we need to make sure that we're letting the state know we're fighting a fire in their area, because they're going to pay the bill. So you have to know what are the rules for your local area. And of course, again, do we have enough resources? So we need a map. You need to make a map that is going to, first of all, you need a map for directing people in. A map provides a way to plot the progress of the fire. So a lot of times firefighters use topo maps, or there are other Zaka maps and things like that. So you can look at the maps to help you with access locations of special hazards. You can use the maps to help you with fire behavior predictions if you've got a relief type map. And, it helps you pick a place for the command post and for staging and all of these things. So most fire departments now have GPS, but you don't want to over rely on GPS, because we do get in areas where we can't use them. So Thomas Brother maps are good for roads and stuff, but you really need a topo map for elevation and land features. So at the minimum, you need a hand-drawn map for your ICS paperwork, because we're going to draw something like this slide where you see all of these have symbols, have meaning, where we've broken up the fire into an A and B and C division. And so, notating where the roads are, where the rivers are, the stream beds, all of this really helps. So if you have to draw your own map on a piece of paper, you do that, you use what you have. Most of the time, the chief will have a plexiglass cover where you can put a topo map underneath, and you use like a grease pencil, and you write on the plexiglass and draw your area where the fire is, and draw in your divisions and things like that. Topo maps are great though. 7.5 topo map uses a 1 to 24,000 scale, and it shows landmarks. So I've included a topo map of my favorite place, Hume Lake, and I can see where my friends' cabins are right there, because every single one of those little black squares are a building. So those lines, we'll talk about this later, but the tight lines indicate rapid elevation change. The wide lines indicate slower elevation change. And of course, the blue indicates water. The black lines indicate roads. The ones that are dotted are dirt roads. The ones that are thicker are paved roads. So all of this helps you in your decision making. Have a good map. So when does Size Up conclude? Well, Size Up, as I said before, it's not a one-time activity. It's continuous. It's a process, constantly. Just like you should constantly be asking yourself, do I have good LCES? You should constantly be reassessing the fire and your tactics. Are our tactics still the right tactics? So LCES is the minimum that you should be asking yourself, but thinking through my 10s and 18s. So the 4 general operating priorities are: number 1, life safety. If we're killing firefighters, we're doing our job wrong. And we need the firefighters, we need the resources, but we also remember, hey, they're human beings. They have family. When a firefighter goes down, it's not just that firefighter that suffers. It's our whole department. It's the families. It's everybody related. So life safety is number 1. Property protection is number 2. Now, some more environmentalist oriented people have suggested that we switch number 2 and number 3, but I still see property protection before resource protection. But we want to make sure that our natural resources are well protected. And then lastly, incident stabilization. We want to be working towards getting the upper hand on this fire. We want to think about our objectives. So we come up with a big action plan. Now we need to come up with specific strategic objectives. Keeping the fire from moving into heavier fuels. Keeping the fire on one side of a canyon. Keep the fire as small as possible. That's a little bit loosey-goosey. I prefer objectives that are more specific. Keep the fire on the west side of the highway. You want to consider all your resources and values that are at risk, your hazards, and make sure all of your tactics, though, and all of the actions are, as you give out assignments, is this going to help us get control of the fire? So you tie the big action plan, objectives, and now you're giving assignments. So make sure everybody knows the plan, make sure everybody knows their assignment and why they're doing what they're doing, the tasks assigned to them. One of the biggest decisions, are we going to be offensive or defensive? We've already talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit faster. Offensive is attacking the fire, one foot in the black, 1 foot in the green. Defensive is where we're moving away from the fire. We might have some offensive action going on, but we realize that even though we might have some hand crews starting to cut some line on the sides, we need to go ahead of the fire, like in a wildland urban interface fire, which we'll talk about next week. In most cases, a defensive action is taken to minimize the damage, not contain the fire. Some units will still be going offensive, trying to contain the fire, but the bulk of our forces are going to be going ahead to save buildings. But when we do have both going on, we need to make sure that they're working together. This slide shows us a crew on one side are working their way up the fire, but some guy on the other side thinks it's a good idea to start a backfire that is definitely going to impact those firefighters. So make sure if you're doing offensive and defensive that they're communicating to each other. You don't want to mix them unless you've really thought that through and are communicating. So direct attack is when we get right on it. And we've seen some slides like this, so I'm just going to go through them really quick. This method of attack is used in lighter fuels, but you know what? We go direct attack in medium fuels as well. You got to be kind of careful in the really heavy fuels, but we want to be working with using a wet line to slow down the fire and then following that up with a fire line down to mineral soil, cooling the fire with water, then constructing the final fire line behind. Direct attack is, used here. They're using a pump and roll type of a situation here where the engine is able to get to most of the terrain. As I mentioned before, you got to consider terrain and soil, and do I have the right kind of pump for pump and roll action? So you don't want to get stuck. And so if we can't do that, we're going to use progressive hose lays or we're going to use hand crews. So here's a hand crew that are attacking a grass fire, very easily done with hand tools under these kind of conditions. These guys are going to make quick work of this, working together, using looks like mostly McLeods, and knocking down this fire, creating a scratch line around it, and then they'll follow it up with a better fire line down to mineral soil. The direct attack advantages are that we're going to minimize the area burned, and direct attack is the safest place to work. Right next to the fire is safer than away from the fire because of the unpredictability. So when you're right there, you have the black is right next to you as an escape route. That's your escape zone or safety zone. It's safe as long as it's adequately burned. So take advantage of the burned out areas. Take advantage of creating a line right on the edge of the fire where you're safest. It eliminates the uncertain elements that are related to being away from the fire and doing backfiring, where you might get caught by a wind change and fire pulling up on you real quick and all the other things that could happen. Some of the disadvantages with direct attack, I'm not in agreement on all of these, but you will be taking heat, smoke, and close to the flames. You're going to feel the heat. You're going to breathe a lot of smoke. But again, it's the most productive and the fastest way to get out of fire. Control lines, though, when you're doing direct attack, you have to go with where the fire went. So you might be going over hill, over dale. You might have to, I've used the hose to climb like I was using a rappelling line or to climb up. Sometimes it's really steep terrain. I've had to dig out with a shovel steps in the side of a hillside because it was so steep. There are cases, and I gave you an example from me, firefighters can accidentally spread burning material across the line, but that's just bad tactics. That's not a disadvantage. The direct attack disadvantages, we may not be taking advantage of natural or existing barriers, but you know what? When we get control of the fire, if we feel we need to burn that area out, we can burn it out. And our book says usually more mop-up and patrol. Well, that's slightly true, but no matter what kind of a fire, we're going to have mop-up and we're going to have patrol. So we talked about some different tactics. Flanking is the most basic attack strategy. You don't have to get fancy. We're going to work our way around the fire, creating a line. We're going to cut off the head. And usually it's more of a pincer than a flanking, but we want to work our way up the sides, cut off the head, and then work our way down the other side or do a pincer. Tandem is where a bunch of engines are working together, doing like a flanking motion, but one goes rapidly to kind of knock things down, another one follows up, and another crew follows up. So you leapfrog if necessary, working together. Pincer action is what I've seen more than anything else. And basically, it's like the flanking action, but we're flanking from both sides. So both flanks are attacked at once. And whether we're pumping and rolling or whether we're doing a progressive hose lay and following up with hand lines, all of these, the initial goal is we want to cut off that head and keep this fire from spreading too far out on the sides and eventually work our way to the head. The head's usually cut off by the Air Force. I have mentioned that before, but a lot of times the first-in helicopter will drop their crew on a ridge line above the fire. They go in, they get water, and they come back, and they start knocking down that head. And if we've caught the fire fast enough, and if they knock down the head, then it's just a matter of working up those flanks. Envelopment is where we send engines to multiple places and they all work towards each other to envelop the fire from various anchor points. It's got to be well coordinated, a little bit harder to do. Okay, and then there's parallel attack where we're slightly off of the fire's edge. I'm not a big fan of this one. I want to be right on the edge. So when you put fuel between you and the fire, you're always taking a big risk. But some people like to do this because they don't get as much heat and smoke. So parallel attack, the line is usually constructed from 6 to 50 feet from the fire's edge. The materials are cast to the unburned side of the line instead of the burned. And you're making a continuous line down to mineral soil, and then maybe you're going to burn that area out. So in light grass, a wet line can be used to fire from. And this key is the line is immediately burned out after construction, so you carry the fire with you as you go, with drip torches or with fusees. Use parallel attack in light fuels where you can maneuver to your advantage. You go to a road or you create a line, you get a little bit ahead of the fire, and you backfire in. You know what? Our author likes this tactic, but you should never use this tactic if there's any danger of not being able to burn out the fuels between the fire and you. So if you're not far enough ahead of the speed of spread, you could get yourself stuck where now the fire's burning up on you and you have nowhere to go because you got fire on one side and unburned fuel on the other side, and unburned fuel in between you. It can be really effective when you got dozers, hand crews, and wet lines working together in a coordinated attack. He sees more advantages than I do. I'd rather be right on the fire line. You're not going to take as much heat and smoke when you do parallel attack, and you can maybe take advantage of natural barriers. But fire can cross the fire line before it's burned out. The burned area is not readily available as a safety zone. Now you don't have the black to run in. It fails to take advantage of the fire line that is burned out on its own, and it is going to increase the area burned. So indirect attack we use when a direct attack is not possible or practical. So we're going to select the ground. We're going to go to a road ahead, or we're going to create a line ahead of the fire, some distance from the fire's edge. We can locate the fire along favorable topography roads. We're out of the smoke and heat. We have more time to construct the fire line if we go far enough ahead. And it allows the line sometimes to be constructed in those lighter fuels that might be to our advantage. And hopefully we're going to have less danger of slop over because we're not going to have the spotting because we burned out ahead of the fire. Disadvantage is more acreage is going to be burned, and it can be really dangerous again because the unburned fuel is between us and the fire. The fire can cross the line before it's burned out, and sometimes burning out leaves a bunch of islands that then we got to deal with the islands. And then, it brings into play all of the dangers of burning out. Whenever we're burning out, it's dangerous. Even your drip torch itself is dangerous. You don't use it right. You can set your neighbor on fire. You can accidentally not think about what you're doing and flick some of the fuel on fire into the unburned area. There's, people trip with a drip torch in their hands and or a fusee. Fusees, you're breathing toxic fumes. So, all of this are reasons to consider that the indirect attack method can be of a great concern. Hot spotting is trying to stop the spread of hot burning points along the fire's edge. Extremely dangerous. Sometimes crews will do this. It's to check a rapidly advancing fire. Yeah, you know what? I prefer to let the helicopters do the hot spotting. They'll go to where the big hot spots are. When we put personnel out there, he says here only the most experienced personnel should be used for hot spotting. And we need to have water or retardant drops with us when we're doing. You're putting yourself in a very vulnerable place when you hotspot. Cold trailing is when we're just working along a partially dead line, improving it, an existing or cutting a new line. A lot of times we use our inmate crews for cold trailing, and they follow behind. They're not doing the really, really serious firefighting. Line constructed during cold trailing may not be part of the final control line, but a lot of times it is. Excuse me, I had to take a drink. So once we get control of the fire, get it basically knocked down, then we need to do mop-up. We're going to just kind of go through a couple of concepts on mop-up. When the fire's been contained, that's when we really get to work. There's a lot of hard work with mop-up. If we've laid out a good progressive hose lay, then we're going to have 1-inch lines that are spaced at 200 to 300 foot intervals. And we can use those to help us with mop up, getting out the hand tools. We want to make sure that the fire's totally out. Excuse me. If all the material is not extinguished, we can have a rekindle, and we don't want that. It really makes us look bad. So you're going to find hot material sometimes even months after a fire was controlled if you don't properly mop it up. So with mop up, it's a very important phase, and a lot of fires have rekindled because improper mop up was done. The Oakland fire was started by a fire that happened the day before, and it was one of the biggest loss of homes until our recent fire up in Paradise area, the Camp Fire, I think that was called. They put out a fire, but they didn't properly mop it up. They came the next day to finish mopping it up, and a big wind gusted, picked up some embers, threw it into the grass, and the rest is history. 25 people died in that fire, and over 2,000 homes. I forget the final number. Hey, I already said that. Dry mop up is when we don't have a lot of water or retardant available to us. So it's basically working with hand tools. We separate the burning material, we pile it and allow it to burn, and we stir things up. We pull the hot material away, and just by spreading it out, sometimes we're going to cool it. We might put a little dirt on top of things or smother them and use it to cool. A wet mop up is when we do have some water, and maybe all we have is a back pump, which that's more dry mop up than wet mop up. But when we have water, we're usually going to use Class A foam or some kind of a wetting agent to make it more effective and help it penetrate into the fuels. So we want to use a proper amount. We don't want so much foam in foam concentrate that we don't have the cooling effectiveness of the water, but we do want to increase the amount of foam because it'll help it penetrate. So you want to apply the water in a fine spray. You want to use your water wisely. We're going to apply our mop up from the control line in. We're going to work in from the edges. We want to apply from the outside of a hot area inward to the center. So you use a straight stream when you need to penetrate the dirt, like when we have a stump hole or a place where we've got a hot pineapple or whatever. We might hit it with some straight steam, and you'll get this kickback, blowback. You have to be careful because that's boiling water that will splash back on you. So you want to be careful, keep your distance, don't get too close, but you use it, I call it hydraulicking. You kind of hydraulic the area, and then maybe you let somebody with a tool stir it up, and then you hydraulic a little bit more until you stop getting all that steam, and you listen for the sound. You'll hear a sizzling sound. So you want to spray, stir, and spray again. And of course, use wetting agents, as I said. Use the hand tools, mix, stir, scrape. It's a combination. We're going to work together till we cool it, separate it, spread it. So be aware, though, there's a lot of hazards when you're mopping up. Watch out for widowmakers, overhanging or leaning trees. Look for those. Mark any tree that looks dangerous, or even cordon off an area and warn everybody about widowmakers. Every year we lose firefighters, usually U.S. Forest Service firefighters or CAL FIRE firefighters, people who are out there on these bigger dense forest area fires. Really, really dangerous, the dead trees, the dying trees, the widowmakers. You want to be careful of trees that could have had their roots burned away. We want to take very special note of anything where it could roll downhill and spread fire. So we're going to do trenching around that. Watch out for bees and snakes and anything else that might bite you, eat you, kill you. Be careful for dirt and rocks that may be kicked up by the water stream. Like I said, from experience, I know it can be really hot, and you want to know that you're going to get that blowback, that flashback towards you from the hot spots. You don't want to trip into one of those hot spots. In our book, we have a picture of the guy whose hand is extremely burned. That's somebody who tripped and put their hand into a stump hole. Stump holes can be up to 1,000 degrees. So be aware, always wear your eye protection. Um, I only wore the eye protection when I really needed it, but you definitely want to have your gloves on. Um, Kick your boots every once in a while. Your boots are going to get caked with mud, and when you're on steep slopes, you're going to lose your footing, and your boots can turn into skis. So kick them, hit them with your tool every once in a while. Be aware if you're around an area with a retardant drop, it's going to be more slippery. And, don't think that it's now not dangerous. It is dangerous. So when you're mopping up, you keep on your PPEs, you protect your eyes, you protect your hands, and also you still need to have your fire shelter. So don't be taking off your helmet, don't be taking off your shelter, any of that. Be systematic. Work those hot areas, work from the outside in, work from the hot areas to the cool areas. And sometimes you'll be told we want to, on a bigger fire, we want 100 feet in, or we want 200 feet in, and then just hit the hot spots inside of that. Sometimes they'll say they want 100% mop up. One of the ways you can tell if you're being effective is if you see little bits of white ash and then you hit it with water, you'll notice it's all black. Look for heat coming up from areas. You can see the heat waves. So make sure you examine the area. Look for bugs. The bugs kind of go to those convective heat areas, so look for gnat, accumulations of gnats. Smell, hearing, seeing, all of these help you know if you're being effective or not. So, go in an organized manner. Maybe you use a grid system or a block system. Use those senses: sight, touch, smell, and hearing. Look for smoke, look for heat waves, look for white ash, look for stump holes, and like I said, look for steam. When you hit an area and steam comes off it, it's still hot. You need to put more water there, and like I said, use gnats. So there's a difference in the smell between an area that's been hit with water. It has a different smell than the smell of smoldering fuels, and you'll learn that as you get more experience. So use your nose. Listen for the sounds: cracking, popping, hissing. And when we do snag removal, that needs to be an experienced feller, a sawyer who has done this before and is well trained. There are classes that they go to, they get super training. These guys can usually drop a tree on a dime, so make sure that you're careful, but know that when they drop these, they're going to get a bunch of embers coming off of them. So they always want to fall inside, not outside the line. If you're not trained, don't be taking a chainsaw to a tree. After the fire's out, we're going to patrol it. We're going to get usually patrolmen or an engine company that is sent to certain areas to look for weak spots in the line and watch for hot spots. A lot of times we'll get phone calls from panicked people in the night. I see some smoke inside the line, and it's kind of like, really, we got to go out there. But we want to make sure that we're looking for any spot fires that are outside the line. And that is of great control. So a lot of times I used to have to do this, have to patrol all night. Everybody got to go back to bed, and I had to stay out there in my patrol and drive around the line of the fire. So, yeah, the intensity of the patrol decreases as the danger decreases. Usually that night, maybe the next day. Sometimes one patrol will be sent out for a certain time, and then another patrol is rung out and sent out to relieve them, and you switch, so that everybody can at least get some sleep. But you want to post lookouts to watch for flare-ups and spots. Move around, look for the spot fires. Uh, Pay particular attention to areas where only water was used. Well, we shouldn't do that. We need to have a control line around everything. And we want to look for total extinguishment and work in pairs, systematic approach. Okay, that's it. Be prepared to share if you are patrolling a fire. It's just like transferring a command when somebody else shows up. Hey, I'm sorry this was over an hour, but this was a really important one. And there is an assignment. There's going to be a pop quiz with this module, so make sure you get that done. Hopefully you watched this because I gave the answers to the pop quiz in this lecture. Have a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy.